Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFA York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the fourth 2024 session of the Emergency Management in Hospitals and Healthcare Speaker Series, presented in partnership with the Thunder Bay Regional Health Sciences Center. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Tekaronto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our panelists, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Misha Richard. Misha Richard is the current Emergency Preparedness Lead for the Thunder Bay Regional Health Sciences Center in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. In this role, she acts as a subject matter expert, assisting with the development and maintenance of emergency management governance, training materials, and exercises. Misha also volunteers as an editor for the Canadian Journal of Emergency Management and is happy to be a collaborator and facilitator for the CFAL York series. She holds a Master of Disaster and Emergency Management degree from York University and bachelor's degrees from Western University and Brandon University in the focus areas of political science and disaster studies. Misha, thank you very much for moderating today's session and your ongoing support organizing this series. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Francesco, for that lovely intro as always. I will kick things off right away by introducing our guests for our panel today. It's going to be a mouthful because everybody here has phenomenal backgrounds to share with you. We've got Andrew Mole, who's with us today. Some of you might remember him from a previous session, so we appreciate having Andrew back with us. Andrew's been involved in healthcare emergency management since 2014 and is currently the manager of the emergency and disaster management for Hamilton Health Sciences in Hamilton, Ontario. In addition, he is currently a co-course creator for the York University Disaster and Emergency Management Graduate Studies Program, teaching emergency management in healthcare since 2019. Andrew also sits on several committees for the Association of Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Professionals, also known as AHEP, including the Education and Resource Committee, and is a passionate believer in bringing healthcare EM professionals together to collaborate and advance best practice in the industry. Andrew has completed 2 master's degrees. His first was in history at the University of Waterloo, and his second degree was in disaster and emergency management from York University. I'd also like to welcome Eileen Benedictus, who's with us today, who is the Manager of Risk, Privacy, and Emergency Preparedness at North Bay Regional Health Sciences Center in North Bay, Ontario. In this role, she facilitates multidisciplinary committees to ensure that emergency incident response and business continuity plans are created, maintained, and tested. She enjoys working with stakeholders to create a vision and turn it into reality, and recently organized a community mock Code Orange CBRNE event that included city emergency services and the local college. This was very exciting and maybe a story for another day. Eileen has worked in a leadership role in various departments of the hospital for almost 2 decades and has a vast understanding of the healthcare organization. When she's not working, she also enjoys spending time with her family. And I love that you included this as well, which includes her 3 dogs and 12 ducks. Then we've got Grayson Cockett with us today, who works as a healthcare disaster manager, paramedic, and educator, and also a mountain bike coach. He volunteers with Canada Task Force 2, supporting all hazards incident management team preparedness, and serves on the board of the International Association of Emergency Managers Alberta region. A passionate advocate for the profession, Grayson actively shares his interest in disasters and their management through education, training, public speaking engagements, and his award-winning educational podcast, The Emergency Preparedness in Canada, or EPIC. And last but not least, I have Shannon Saunders with us as well. Shannon is the site director for Mount Sinai Morningside, a major New York City hospital in one of the largest not-for-profit health systems in the city. Shannon is responsible for the development and delivery of strategic goals for a comprehensive emergency management and business continuity program at the local level, and leads change management across the system. Previously, Shannon has worked in academic community and was responsible for developing new emergency preparedness risk and continuity program for a major Canadian university. And before that, also worked for the Attorney General. Over the past 18 years, Shannon has worked on numerous projects and initiatives around the world with extensive experience working with local, state, and federal agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations and private sector partners. Shannon has actively responded to global disasters for over 15 years, including hurricanes, wildfires, public health crises, armed conflict, plane crashes, and earthquakes. She continues to deploy to global disasters as an integral part of an international disaster response team. Shannon is considered a thought leader in the field of emergency management, as presented at numerous conferences and events throughout her career. She is dedicated to ensuring communities are prepared for emergencies and disasters, and is committed to advancing the field of emergency management through education, research, and advocacy. Shannon also earned her bachelor's of public policy from York University and a master's degree in disaster emergency management from Royal Roads, and is actually currently pursuing her doctorate of business administration at National University. So, like I said, a big mouthful. We've got some phenomenal panelists with us today. It's also at this time that I want to offer our regrets for who was our fifth panelist, Katie Sabatina. She has sent her regrets, as is the state of affairs when you work in emergency management. Some other priorities came up that supersede this presentation. So, without continuing further, I'll throw out the stereotypical housekeeping rules. We've got, close to 100 people that are participating right now online, and the chat is open to you. So we encourage you to throw your conversation points in there as we begin having this dialogue about mass notification and fan out processes. But if you have questions that you would like directed specifically to any one of our panelists, please put them in the Q&A. I'll try to monitor that Q&A while I'm also going back and forth with our panelists over the questions that we've kind of pre-selected. So hopefully we'll be able to address a lot of the questions that you have just right off the bat. But again, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A and keep the chat as sort of that open dialogue for all of you as attendees. So some of you might not be familiar with what a mass notification system is, let alone perhaps when we start throwing these different terms around, like we're saying fan out process. So I'll quickly just give a summary overview of what this means, what we're talking about today, before we get into tearing that all apart and explaining all the different ways that we do this as various organizations. So what is a mass notification system? Ultimately, it's a system that simultaneously broadcasts real-time alerts and information to large groups of individuals. So you can think of the Alert Ready system here in Ontario, different emergency alerting systems that might exist at, state, city level, provincial level. You might have also experienced them if you've been on a university or college campus. And so similar, we have a number of healthcare organizations that have a mass notification system, which is going to quickly alert people to potential threats or emergency situations and give them some instruction as far as how they need to respond. So what is a fan out process? So these also can be automated, but for the purposes of this panel, we're going to kind of separate out and talk about, mass notification is an actual electronic tool of some kind that we're utilizing, and fan out processes are when we're referring more to the manual steps, sometimes called a call tree or a phone tree. Basically, it's that hierarchical communications model where you want to notify individuals in an emergency event, but basically you have one person is calling another person or a group of people until that message flows out to everybody within the organization. And, if one person doesn't answer, they're supposed to keep calling until somebody answers. So obviously a more time-consuming process, but many of us are still operating with that manual setup. So again, a little bit of context. Last year, I threw out an industry scan to see who was able to provide some information about what they're using. Ended up having 34 hospitals and healthcare networks that got back to me with some information about this. And ultimately, we have 38% out of those who provided feedback to me that don't have a mass notification system and still use a manual fan out process. So about 40%. So we're thinking of a 60-40 split between who's got a tool and who's doing things the manual old-fashioned way. This will be very interesting to talk as a panel here today about some of the pros and cons, some of the different ways we're using these systems, perhaps different models that we've used over time. So the first question that I wanted to put out, and obviously I'll say, raise your hand or jump right in if nobody is speaking, is to basically ask, what are you using your process for? Do you have a mass notification system or a manual process? And are you using that process to alert, for the purposes of calling staff in, just for certain emergency scenarios? Basically, tell our audience a little bit of how you're using this process. Who'd like to go first? Grayson, jump right in.
Sure, thanks very much. Yeah, Grayson Cockett from Alberta Health Services. Our organization might be a little bit different in that it's really a provincial health services organization, so not just hospitals, but other health services as well. We've defined things a little bit differently. So we have purchased like an emergency mass alerting solution and are combining multiple pieces of technology and multiple solutions to bring what we're calling like the capability of emergency mass alerting. So we've kind of separated the technology from the capability because we expect to use multiple bits of technology and that sort of thing. And we've broken it up into three kind of buckets or areas that we're trying to develop, very similar to what you were talking about, Misha. The first one is emergency response team activation. So that can mean incident management team activation within a command post or an ECC or emergency coordination center, something like that. Or it could mean something as simple as activating your medical emergency response team. So code blue or whatever codes you use out there. We've also bundled into the emergency response team activation that idea of contacting off-duty staff to come in urgently for mass casualty incident, or known as fan out. We found that fan out was a very confusing term, so we just rebranded it as emergency staffing request. So that's one type of alert that we send out. So that bucket of emergency response team activation is really focused on a much smaller group. And I've kind of defined it functionally as sending a pre-established message to a pre-established group to undertake a pre-established and well-identified response activity. So very much a simple system in that one. The second big bucket, and this is where I'm not totally sure I agree with mixing the term alerting and notification, is emergency mass alerting. So this is, there's a fire, get out now. This is the, here's the hazard, here's your immediate required life safety response activity, and here's where to go find out more. So something we're all familiar with provincial emergency alerting systems. And then the last bucket is emergency notifications, which I know this separation between alerting and notification isn't super well supported in the literature. It's kind of mix and match on whether or not that term is used. But notifications in my world are not action driven. They are kind of updates or just information only. So we're pushing out really critical emergency information to either a broad group or a focus group of people, but we've decided to make it less intrusive than an emergency alert. So for example, an emergency alert, we might use phone, text, email, app, billboards, like every piece of every channel we've got available to us. Emergency notification, we might just push out via text and email, depending on the severity, and then those emergency response team activations, because it's urgent as well, much smaller group, but we'll use every channel that we can to reach that group. So that's how we've broken it up, and super excited to hear how other people have done that as well.
So considering you're the only panelist that's representing an entire provincial health network, clearly anybody that's in attendance can see how many different variables are a part of this process. Andrew?
Sorry, I was just raising my hand to go next.
Jump in.
But I won't repeat a lot of what Grayson said, because we use our system in a very similar fashion. What's interesting where we are right now currently is actually quite exciting, is that previously we did have an alert system, But at the time, leadership didn't provide what really is adequate funding. And I think, and we'll probably approach this topic for later in the discussion, but so we're an organization of around 16 to 18,000 staff, volunteers, physicians, and I got funding for 500 accounts. So it was really a leadership-based activation, a lot of incident management and awareness. Our IT group actually uses it actually more often than we do in terms of activating their response team to deal with minor outages and kind of that code gray or whatever infrastructure outage code color is in use as kind of like a pre-assessment before it escalates. But I'm happy to say we have since gotten executive VP got upset with a response once and just said throwing money at it. So now we're getting a new system with all staff. And so what's interesting is the level of possibilities of not only just fan out, which traditionally was unit by unit. It was up to them to do the fan out tree because it was really only leaders who had the emergency notification. But there's discussions around replacing pagers, about the technology out there is incredible, where there's collect functions where frontline staff members are going to be able to take pictures or videos of a hazard or an incident that's ongoing and relay that information back to a command group. So it feeds into a situational awareness piece as well. So quite exciting, and we're literally in the middle of the process of onboarding this system, which is quite extensive and time consuming, and I'm happy to go over the challenges and trials that you can look forward to if you take that journey. But it's interesting switching from that very limited system to being lucky and getting that corporate buy-in to really expand to that. What we're kind of excited about is that world of possibilities of not just emergency notification or getting that rapid fan out to staff or the alerting and activation, but what else can we do with this technology? We're playing an exercise actually in September where we'll simulate a cyber attack that knocks out all forms of communication. But because the system lives outside our network, it will be the only form of communication. So we're going to see how well it functions as that potential emergency backup piece. I see Shannon planning the same exercise.
Andrew, you're getting ahead of me. We haven't even talked about real life incidents or drills, and you're already there.
I'm sorry. I'll step down from that. But it's even with experience from a previous organization, it's interesting going from that. If you only need that mass notification for your leadership, it can work really well just having it for that simple function. But if you can get that buy-in, it does really expand your reach to keeping people better informed, but also your capabilities and your situational awareness overall.
So I just want to quickly comment, because obviously one of the questions that attendees want to know is, what are the different solutions that we're using? And I'm not putting each of you on the spot to share that. So part of it is to kind of acknowledge to those that are joining us today that there's a variety of tools that are out there. Some of them are very broad in the suite of different tools that are a part of their package. Some are very narrow in the scope. So all sorts of different products out there. There's Rave, there's Everbridge, there's Call 'em all, Text 'em all, Call Fire. There's, a bunch of other things. Some staffing solution softwares have that kind of emergency call out function embedded in them. So people might have those sorts of products that they're working with. There's newcomers sort of on the stage, like BlackBerry solution. There's a bunch. So I am not trying to promote any particular one, just trying to acknowledge to those in attendance that our panelists and others that participated in that industry scan that was conducted and referenced at the beginning are using a variety of different tools. On top of the fact that my own internal organization, we use the manual fan out process. We do not have an overarching mass notification solution. So does anybody else want to just kind of touch on how you're using this process? Do you have a manual or an electronic solution? And if so, how are you putting that to use? Eileen?
So we have Rave as well. We only use it though for Code Orange. We decided to go very specific, and it's all built with staff that would need to be responding for an external disaster. And so we have in that system the ED nurses, ED clerks, respiratory therapists, and then facility staff like security, environmental services, porters, materials management, switchboard, the boots on the ground people. So the physicians aren't included because they don't have hospital, they're not in our active directory for the hospital. So it just becomes a manual process, but they have a different system that we would utilize. And so, as I said, it's just very specific for Code Orange, where for everything else, we would have to, for all other staff, we would have to do a manual approach. But we're very similar to where Andrew was, where we only have 500 licenses. So that's why I just went with Code Orange. Now, if we had another sort of emergency that would need those people, we could use it, but all of our templates and everything are pre-populated for Code Orange, and the training is for Code Orange specific. As for calling in like our incident management team, our leadership, because of the size of our hospital, we would just do it, they would just phone a friend basically, or we have Voicera app, so we could use the Voicera app for that as well to call in like our leadership team for the incident management. Very simple process for us.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of in a similar state for anyone that doesn't realize we're both kind of in the Northern Ontario group. And so, yeah, we aren't dealing with multiple campus, locations or broader scale. But before I jump to Grace, and I know your hand was up, I was going to say we haven't heard from Shannon yet. So Shannon, do you want to explain how you folks are using your system?
Sure, yeah. So we're huge. We have a staff base across our system of 40,000 staff, all of which have the opportunity to join. We have about a 60% uptake. So I think we're just over 28,000 or something like that. My math is probably off significantly. We use Everbridge. Grayson, I think, had it in the chat. It's one of many systems that work. It works. It does what we want it to do. I love it. I know how to use it. I'm not overly attached to it. If we got a new system tomorrow, it wouldn't bother me all that much. How we work is we have 3 different levels of notification or alerting. And that term we kind of use interchangeably. The first is awareness. So this is an all notice that something is afoot in the city. Something is going on, something is wrong. We used it, for example, in the earthquake that we had a couple weeks ago, because that's not a normal event in New York City. And we just needed to let everybody know, hey, we know there was an earthquake. We felt it too. We're checking all of our buildings. So far, everything is good. So that's kind of that we need to get a message out to make sure that everybody is okay with what's going on and let them know that we know, and we'll provide them with more information on other systems outside of our alerting system. And we have a few of those. We also sent one last night for the protests at Columbia. My hospital happens to be right next door. So it's those types of events we'd send an all staff awareness to. The downside of our system, and I think it's a failure of how we set it up rather than the system, is we can't specify which staff is at which hospital. So when we do this awareness, it goes across the health system. 99% of the time, it's important information for the entire health system. 1% of the time, it's important information for my facilities only. The next one is activation. So when we activate our emergency operation plan, we'll send out an activation notice. The notice really says, and we don't use codes, but I'll translate it into codes because it's super easy. Our activation basically says we've activated the emergency response plan to level 1 to 4. We pick one. And then we say for the event, and we use plain language. So we'll say for a fire, for a whatever, but you could easily drop in code red, code orange, however you want to do it. And then at the site, on the date, and then if we have any other instructions, we'll add those instructions. So rather than, and this is something new for us, we had a different notification for every single code, every single major hazard that we had. And it wouldn't be every single because you'd have a million of these templates. So we simplified it this year and went to one template that added the event. You put in what kind of event it is, and we know how to respond. If it's an odd event, we're going to add some instructions. And then our third is our incident management team huddle. So this goes to our ESF leadership because we also dropped the ICS model this year and we're using an essential support function model. So this goes to all of our senior leaders of all of our departments as kind of grouped into these functions. And that immediately calls them, they press 1 and it links them to the Zoom, or if they're on a phone that's equipped with Zoom, they press the Zoom link on their text and they can zoom into the call immediately. So that's kind of for the immediate piece. So that's kind of how we do it, but we also mix in the fan out process. So a lot of times the activation, the IMT huddle, go to our leadership, go to our department heads. Not every staff is connected. Like I said, we're only about 60%. So we expect our department heads to then fan out. And they use everything from, we have WhatsApp groups, we use Voicera as well. So we have some Voicera connections. We're using now, we have the Epic system and we're using Epic iPhones where all of our nursing staff have iPhones. So it goes directly to their iPhones. And then for our cybersecurity piece, we actually use Alertus so that we can do pop-ups on the different computer screens. So when we have something like Citrix go out, we can pop up and say, don't sign out of Citrix or you'll get kicked out of Epic. You won't be able to get back in. And that's exclusively used by our digital technology partner team. So that's kind of the one side note. So that's our fancy system. That's not so fancy.
Okay, so it's almost giving me heartburn when I start looking at all the different ways that we can do this and try to figure out what's a best practice when there's no one size fits all for an organization. We all very clearly have to figure out what's going to work best for our teams. Hopefully, as everybody is, kind of hearing this additional detail that's joined today, it really shows you there's a lot of potential ways to filter this this information. And Grayson, hopefully you still remember your thought. Now that I'll flip it back to you, you still have your hand up.
Sure thing. Yeah. Shannon, it sounds like we've got some similarities in the use and we just kind of called them different things. To answer the original question about systems in use, Alertus, ConnectRocket, and our big one is Rave. The reason we have so many kind of mixed technologies is quite honestly, we're a bit late to the game of kind of centralizing and organizing emergency mass alerting. So the need was there long before we were able to get the contract and get the leadership support. So individual departments kind of purchase their own solutions. And that's one of our big challenges, but also opportunities, is kind of combining all the technology we've got out there and with the goal of that common message across all platforms to kind of the right people at the right time. One of the things that Eileen mentioned was about who we target, and I saw a couple questions in the chat as well. The way that we kind of set it up is, as step 1, we just linked all of the contact information in our global directory to Rave Alert in this case. And so everyone in our organization or affiliates already has a kind of basic profile with basic information. Of course, nobody's personal cell phone is in global directory, and we had to have a chat with privacy around how we could do that. And basically, the answer was, if they did it themselves, that is consent to use their personal cell phone. So it's just an opt-in process, and they just add their personal details, whatever they want to be contacted on, to their account. And that is great because it gets around privacy. A little bit of a problem because it means we don't really control who gets the message. It's totally up to them as to whether they opt in or not. Same sort of thing, we're kind of rolling out an app and it'll be kind of an opt-in based approach for that. So our stretch goal is to alert anyone in our facility, so including patients eventually. We're not there yet, and we're going to just work on staff and affiliates to start, and then they can be our conduit to patients to relay that information. I want to pick up on what Shannon said. Like we in AHS, we're kind of stuck with codes until we have a big organizational change on that one. But one of my hills to die on was emergency mass alerting does not use codified or complex language. So in emergency mass alerts, we are going to stick with plain language. So one step away from codes, but at least it sort of is a really clear message to a very defined group, which in this case is our staff and affiliates. Also around who we can target, we thought it would be really, so Shannon, I'm going to one up you at 40,000. We got 170,000 people to work on with staff and affiliates. And it was really important to us that we don't broadcast something happening in like Edson to someone in Vulcan or kind of across the province. So developing like geo-targeted alerts was really important for us, and then developing alerting by attribute. So basically alerting by where do you work? You can kind of filter through where do you work, or who do you work for, or what team are you on, that sort of thing. And we're still fleshing that out, exactly what attributes we want to assign to everybody. And it's a massive project because 170,000 people, and only some of them are defined already in our kind of staff directory. So huge process there, but critical for emergency mass alerting. If I know there's some debate on whether the cry wolf phenomenon is real in emergency mass alerting, but I know for our organization, if your phone's going off every day about stuff that doesn't directly impact you, then it'll get left behind. So really important that when your phone explodes with these alerts, that it's applicable to you and that it's urgent and immediate. The last thing we did, and I'm just going to drop these in the chat instead of going over them one by one, is around the way we use it. There were a lot of questions around why we're buying this solution, and there are a lot of things that emergency mass notification or alerting systems can do. I think, Andrew, as you mentioned, replacing pagers, or one of the things that our organization was really interested in the pandemic was alerting or notifying patients of their test results and that sort of thing, and very expensive to do that via normal methods. We don't want to get into any of that. We want emergency alerting to be about emergency alerting. So we came up with these criteria. It took a while to get these kind of approved, and I'll just drop them in the chat here. But basically, we drew brackets around it: emergencies only. It has to actually fix a problem. So there's a lot of good ideas out there that aren't really that urgent to address. One good one is around emergency notifications, or just providing incident updates. We have our situation report process that gets sent out by email, and it works fine. There's no need to replace that with technology. It works just fine. You know, yes, we could do it with this, but we're not here to fix things that aren't broken. Unless it's being shown that it's ineffective. So our number one activity was to kind of address the on-call system and make it more efficient to bring those incident management teams together, because it take like 20 minutes to bring together a group of 15 people just by phone calls. So that was really important. So we did replace the process on that one. Next one was it can't conflict with the incident management system. In a big organization, there are probably a whole bunch of silos working on different emergency response plans and that sort of thing, and maybe they don't all speak to each other. So what we found with this is that the shiny new technology is a good kind of focusing tool to make sure the processes actually speak to each other, because I think someone was mentioning in the chat, but basically automation is the big risk is garbage in, garbage out. So you really have to make sure that the processes are perfect, actually perfect, before you automate them and apply technology. So that's a really big one. And then there's a couple other little holders there, but the last one is you need leadership support. And if you're implementing it at a site or an area or whatnot, this has been the thing we spend the most time on, is making sure that you actually have the sponsorship to do this. And to make it permanent. And we simply won't start implementing it at a site unless we have really high level leadership support there, because this has to be permanent, and it has to be the way that you communicate during emergencies, not just a way. So yeah, that's my 2 cents there.
So this has actually created a good segue. I want to be conscious of time because we have a lot of questions that had kind of filtered in, and I think we've been answering them, but we're kind of moving around with some overlap between some of these. So before I go into talking about accreditation, because I do want to touch on that, so I do want to just put that out there as a reminder that it's coming. Okay, so Grayson, you just commented about sort of that leadership buy-in. Also, Eileen actually put in the chat as a response as far as who has the authorization and their organization, you know, it's a member of the leadership team. That is one of the questions I was going to ask, is who has the authority to activate and who is actually pushing the button in your organizations, because we are all different. And this question comes up time and time again, is who is actually approving and who is issuing. So if we can do this as sort of a quick round table, you know, a minute or less, who's actually authorizing, who's issuing.
So I'll jump in first. So our digital technology partners owns the platform, which is amazing because I don't have to do any of the technical stuff. I am the one for my site or any one of my emergency management colleagues that can pull the trigger, or my designee is what it says in our policy. Our designees can include, we have an administrator on call program where our senior leaders kind of take weekly turns. It can be anyone on our incident commander list, or it can be a nursing supervisor who's generally a WEN staff, so weekends, evenings, nights, holiday staff, who's the head of nursing for that particular WEN shift. They are able to do it as well through telecom. I'm the only person that can go into Everbridge and push that button. Everybody else has to do it through our telecom, who have a set of questions to determine if the notification is appropriate or if it needs to be pushed to our marketing and communications for some other method of situational awareness communication. That's us.
Okay.
So
Andrew, yeah.
yeah, so tying in both to what Grayson was previously saying and to what Shannon just mentioned, and we're kind of again at the kind of hitting the reset button and how we approach this. So we're moving just to, I wasn't sure if we were allowed to say what platform we were using, if we're like, say, so we're going to be using BlackBerry AtHoc. So one of the things previously, it was myself, for a long time, it was only myself who could send the alerts. That was partly out of that kind of check to make sure that it is an emergency, but also the fact that none of my leadership wanted to learn how to do it. So which one weighed more, you know, you probably know the answer. But now we're looking at, now we are going to have leaders have that capability, because if I'm happen not to be available at 2 a.m. I usually wake up, but if, you know, the odd circumstance I don't, you know, it makes more sense that if something needs to be activated more quickly, cut out the middleman and so to speak. And so we're working through that process of identifying who has that authority and for what specific codes, because there's some that like our mass casualty plan, like our ED charge nurse can activate up to a level in terms of activation before things start having organizational, like canceling surgeries and pretty much everything up to that point they can do. So we're approaching it with that lens of, okay, you know, managers should probably be able to fan out to their teams. So, okay, we can allow them to do that. You know, what do directors need? Do we have my team? My team's the ultimate holder is going to be ultimate holder. We did kind of to Grayson's comment earlier, a lot of mission creep when we started the RFP process. A lot of IT and telecom were kind of, you know, looking at the opportunity of, you know, oh, what other things can we do with the system? And we did, and I think Eileen mentioned it in the chat as well, we did put a hard, this is for emergency alerting and notification only. Anything else happens afterwards, you guys can play with it. But right now, this system is 100% emergency management and nothing else. Which was really important, because it was going to be it was amazing how quickly and I think when money's involved, it's really fascinating to watch other departments start migrating to your project when they don't need to be there. But Yeah, so we're in that process of navigating what is the best way to have that approval process, but also making sure that we're not delaying a notification. And what, because for those who don't, I mean, even with our system, we know that for a lot of frontline staff, they're going to find out about what's going on or some version of what's going on a lot faster because they have a WhatsApp group that they're going to quickly tell their colleagues, and staff are going to be made aware very quickly of some version, at least before our official version gets messaged out, which is great, but also can be a challenge to deal with because that's where you can get a lot of misinformation and the rumor mill starting. But it's also great because you can get a very quick, dependable notification organically sent out by your teams.
Okay, so Eileen, I'll pitch it to you, and then I'm going to jump in with some accreditation comments that I think will tie into everything we've been discussing so far. Would you like to add?
I had just a couple comments that haven't really been touched on. So we had to be really careful because our unions are very strong here. And when you're using that mass notification system, you're circumventing your call-in language often, right? So we have to make sure it's coming from the proper authority within the hospital so that we can determine that we're actually using it for an emergency purpose and not just because the doctors are pressuring them in the ED because they feel like they have too many no beds and not enough staff. But is this actually determined? Like, does this actually mean it's an emergency or not? So we really had to put the brakes on with that. So people know that when they can and cannot use it, it has to be authorized, because we have to be able to, support that decision with the unions if that were the case. And then the other thing we've done is I train Switchboard on how to use it. So they're the ones that would actually push the buttons. I can do it. Of course, I'm a super user and a couple other people, but Switchboard are the ones that would go in, push the buttons, pull the reports for the people in the incident management group, because you can't train them. And then also they're going to be too busy taking care of a system. So we put it towards Switchboard. And then also part of that would be that they would call in additional Switchboard support so that they have people to manage this.
Thank you. Also, really good point, and links it right back to kind of the main premise of the question of, do we have a button pusher in this case? And yours is the same as what we would anticipate for mine eventually. So I wanted to talk about accreditation standards. I recognize that we have Shannon as our guest on the panel that's coming to us from New York, and accreditation is not going to apply across the board here. But I wanted to comment on this as essentially perhaps an industry best practice, as what's being captured in some revised standards for Canadian hospitals that tie back to potentially this kind of mass notification process. So I'll say the section's very slow, so that some folks can go dig those up themselves afterwards and start cross-comparing if they feel they're checking the boxes or not, because I think we all have some room to grow. There's section 3.4.3, 3.4.4, 3.4.5, and 3.4.10. So I'll touch on these a little bit. A few of them are recognized as being high priority items versus normal priority, normal versus high. So one is, the organization has an emergency notification system that indicates the appropriate level of activation of the emergency and disaster plan based on the severity and consequence of the event. So for example, the system may have low level activation for contained event. So we could think of maybe, a code brown response team or a code blue response team is kind of the way we were interpreting that. Moderate level of activation, higher level of activation, widespread consequences, and then the highest level. So the sort of catastrophic event that causes a failure of the health services capability in a broad way. We ensure that this notification system, which includes language, codes, levels, categories, whatever we've decided to use, is known, understood, and consistent with other organizations in our community and jurisdiction. So this is something that's also quite interesting. I know we don't have we're a small panel today, but it's been interesting to hear some organizations that have been told by their local law enforcement that you must use this terminology, or in a certain area. I think it might have been Shannon, you telling me at one time that code red is for a fire alarm in schools and everything else in the state. And so that code red language is very kind of ingrained in a community sense. So I think perhaps that's what accreditation is getting at, as far as recognizing that there might be some connection locally to the terminology that makes sense, as well as perhaps a broader jurisdictional level. And then the organization trains its staff on this system, creates standard templates for alerts and other messages, shares the templates with staff to make them familiar with these messages before an emergency or disaster occurs, to obtain their feedback on how to make the messages clearer. So after us talking about, plain language, coded language, how are we getting those messages out there? This is all just one section update. Couple of the other ones, we have a procedure for using our notification system to inform staff and partner organizations. The organization regularly tests the notification system, and as a part of this testing, it also talks about conducting testing on various days, at various times of the day, and in different parts of the organization. That we regularly review and update the needed contact information, and that we ultimately maintain accurate, up-to-date database of contact information for staff to be ready to notify them in an emergency or disaster, including staff that are not at work. And what I want to touch on as well is accreditation standards have a definition for what is staff, and it includes professional staff, it includes our volunteers, it includes our contractors. So these are some big expansions on what we might have viewed in the past as our overhead paging system being enough, perhaps having a senior leadership text tool, being able to use Teams for some organizations and send out a message. Now we really have to think about how are we getting the varying messaging out to all the different types of staff that are under our roof, as including those that are at home, perhaps traveling to and from. And so lots of things to take away there. So my question, with what maybe we have left of time, I think it'll keep us busy, is how are we meeting those sorts of requirements? And maybe what are some of the steps or things that we might be doing that we haven't discussed so far? And Shannon, you had your hand up right away, so please jump in.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the last one, because that, the 3.4.10 is huge. It was in different wording. It was added to our accreditation standards a couple of years ago. And I always want to say accreditation standards always provide a good foundation to build an excellent program on, right? And it's meant for the smaller hospitals to the bigger hospitals. It's really got to be consistent. Northern hospitals, hospitals in Nunavut versus Toronto City hospitals, all of that sort of stuff. So I'm going to give a little tip to being able to manage the accreditation standard and to build your program from there. There is no way that I can force 40,000 people to join our mass notification system. So there's little chance, as we're building these notification systems, that we're going to be able to notify every single person every single time. We are going to make best efforts, which I think a lot of times the accreditation is looking for that, and then looking for continuous improvement, which I could, talk about forever. The key here is to have some way to do something, and we use email. This is the only time that I advocate for the use of email in mass notifications, because I sit at a desk with 3 screens all day and I still don't look at emails for sometimes hours at a time. That's not a great way of communicating with me. But at the very base level of what's being asked for here, we use emails. Our mass notification system, I think somebody asked the question earlier. Our mass notification is attached to our HR system only in that you're employed here and here's your work email. It's up to you to add anything else, but we are going to notify your work email every single time. If you're an EVS cleaner, you probably don't even know you have a work email, but you do. And we're notifying that work email. We do a lot of work to stress doing better than the base standard. Obviously, we want all of our staff to be on mass notification, but we understand that some people are just hesitant and it's just not going to happen. But we use that base email to make sure that we're meeting that standard every single time. Little tip for today.
No, it's great. I think it goes right back to the very beginning when Grayson was talking about it's not a silver bullet. There isn't one particular tool or way to do this. And I feel like we could continue to kind of reiterate that in different ways about there isn't one way, but there might be a base sort of foundational checkbox like what you're mentioning. Andrew?
Yeah, 100% agree with Shannon that email is that base function that, yes, for accreditation, the only way, especially when you're dealing with beyond organization issued devices and like leadership, like, so if they have work numbers, privacy wise, and we found this out very quick. It's not the old school phone books that the government used to hand out and everyone had everyone's phone number. That information is now considered private. So it is an opt-in. We're at email though, you can, your staff have no option, they all have a work email, so they will get their work email. It's interesting with physicians, especially with us, we're partnered with McMaster University. So a lot of our physicians, they have an HHS email. They do not look at that email. You have to use their McMaster email. And so it does make it challenging in terms of incentivizing staff. So BlackBerry has an app, which we're very excited to get that function. We've partnered with security that they have a duress button feature with that app as well. And so that's a bit of a selling point. And I'm excited, Shannon, that you said you had 60% uptake for staff. So that makes me very hopeful for ours. I was getting about like a straw poll when I was walking around units, around 80% in some areas, depending on how many code whites they had, typically, or violent person issues they had. But anyway, we're looking at that real challenge of almost marketing. Or it is not almost, it is straight marketing to staff of why it's important to sign up, what are the benefits of signing up, to really overcome that, even using that, even using FOMO almost, because with mass casualty, you always know you're probably going to have more staff self-respond, but you can almost use that sometimes to your own advantage. So again, we're in that finding out process of how we're going to do this. We're going to partner with our communications team and marketing experts as well to try and to get that pushed out and get as much uptake as possible. But yeah, that email function is, in terms of accreditation, that's key. And then as well, a lot of these platforms, you can make, it's really important to make sure you identify your community partners. So if you've got our city emergency managers will be added to our system, our paramedic chiefs, police chiefs, and then as well several main community groups that we work with, the university administration as well, because we share, hospital shares a campus. So it's really identifying those community partners and making sure they're in your system. Because obviously if something's happening, it's really important for them to know what's going on in case they need to be able to assist. So it's not just for that in-house notification. It's important to make sure that if you can, include your community partners in as well, so you can give them as quick a heads up as possible, so you can get that help if it's needed.
Yeah, I feel like that's something as well that these updated standards have highlighted, as far as kind of that broader piece between just within your building. And even when we're talking about the percentage of uptake in using these different systems, which has now been mentioned a couple of times. I always refer back to, even with an overhead paging system in a building, there are dead zones within that building, and those teams are supposed to have redundancies in place to make sure to communicate that message to the staff in those spaces that have low audibility. And so if you can even hit a certain number of staff with that message, it's going to continue to percolate out, even if you can't get a hold of every individual. Grayson, you jumped in there with your
Sure, I was just going to build on what Andrew said. Is the way we've kind of had some success in its early days for us for rollout. So I don't have a stat on uptake, but make it easy, make it valuable, and then make the promise that you will never use it unless it's an emergency. Because if they start getting spam, they'll just turn it right off. Ways we've made it easy, instructions, and we've kind of done the work in a lot of the case with leadership is one-on-one, break out your phone, let's work with you to get it opted in and that sort of thing. And very, very, very time consuming, but then they can teach the next person, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one thing that worked. For making it valuable, Andrew, we're in the same boat trying to roll out this app, and how can we make the app something they'd want to download anyways, and then just push emergency stuff to that. And so far we've just got the emergency functions, like some links to plans and important numbers and whatnot, but there's a couple other things we might be able to throw in there. And then, yeah, that promise to only use it in emergencies is something we're going to be very strict on, to the point of revoking author licenses if it's used inappropriately. And we have a guidelines for use document that they have to sign off on and that sort of thing. Going back to one of the other questions around who sends out, we have no choice but to have a distributed sender network. So we've got about 200 authors right now, and we're expecting about 1,000 across the organization, because each department and site and area will have to have its own sender. So that's the model we have to work with.
I know we only have a few minutes left. I knew that this hour would just fly by on this topic. As somebody that's sitting here representing an organization that is majority manual fan out process, one of our concerns has been around, yes, keeping the database of staff, which ties back to whatever system you're using, whether it's manual or a tech solution of some kind. And the actual testing of that functionality. So for us, we put a corporate call out a couple of times a year that all these different teams are to update what their paper fan out lists are. And then we test that manual process twice a year. So ultimately we say there's 4 opportunities to flag updates that are needed. But in doing the testing, we're very limited on the window of time, particularly that's after hours, that we're going to do this full call out process. And so perhaps with the last couple of minutes, I would ask if anyone wants to share a story of, an interesting takeaway from a real deployment, or some commentary around how you test this functionality. Andrew, you were quick to throw your hand up, and then Shannon.
Yeah, sure. I'll just do testing where we just incorporate it into, so we do our code of the month, and we announce it in the building, and staff and our code captains respond accordingly. I've just attached previously with our previous system, just adding a test to that. So we'll just send a test alert with that, and that'll be the process with BlackBerry moving forward, is just add it as a process of our monthly testing. Obviously scheduling quarterly tests as well to get all contacts, and with our previous system with the 500 contacts, I had to manage that manually. And I advise, if anyone gets an electric system, link it to your HR system. Managing it manually is a nightmare. So please avoid at all costs. But that regular quarterly all contacts test was good in that sense, that it let me know, who's playing musical chairs in terms of changing leadership positions internally, who's on mat leave, who's left the organization, who's new. And it also makes sure that, phone numbers were correctly entered. Looking forward to having it linked to our HR system. But again, that system's not always perfect as well. So it's good to, those regular quarterly mass ones will still go out. And if you're charged for, if you have a multimodal system that sends it out and you get charged, say, for texts and calls, which I know we will, just email. And if you have an app, like a push notification, it doesn't have to be the whole, necessarily all the whole system. But if you're worried about incurring any additional fees, just typically with emails free. So just go through that process.
So Shannon, so again, we're very close to time. Do you
I
want to
got
throw in
it.
an example?
Yeah, so I just wanted to tell a quick story about an event that we had a few months ago. We had a train derailment of the #1 train, which is the busiest train in all of Manhattan, right between our two hospitals on the west side. So Morningside's on the north side of the Upper West Side, West is on the south side. We share leadership. So we share all of our physicians, our emergency medicine's one department. And when this train derailment happened, it happened right between us. And we sent out a code orange or an MCI notification, and we didn't have location and we didn't have incident details in that template at that time. We've since got rid of some of those templates. This was one of the impetus to do that. And our head of anesthesiology, for example, is like, where do I go? Do I go to West? Do I go to Morningside? Where am I supposed to be? Because if the MCI is at the wrong hospital, she's not there to help and support. And we're really 20 minutes away and the train's not running. So we can't get there quickly. So it really was a huge lesson for us in making sure that those templates were super tight. I know we want to be quick with the information because it's calling you, it's texting you. We don't want to put a ton of unnecessary stuff in there. But that was a huge lesson for us to make sure that you're giving some details. Because all we said was train derailment. We have 4 levels of MCI that the fire department sends out. The fire department said this was a level C at first. They put out a level C MCI, which is a big deal. D is the worst. And our staff didn't know where to go or didn't know where the patients were going to go. FDNY didn't know where the patients were going to go either, and we ended up with extra patients at the wrong hospitals, but that's another story. But it really taught us to be very tight with our templates, and that's kind of the last thing I'll leave you with is lesson learned.
No, that's a good way to end it. It's kind of circling to the entire point of why do you have these systems? It's the message that you want to get out. And we don't want to lose sight of that and take lessons away each time we end up having to use the system. How can we potentially improve what that message is? I want to thank everybody for your time. I feel like this is the sort of topic that perhaps we should revisit in the future, especially since, again, we're using different systems and all of us in healthcare are using this in, modified ways from one another. So for now, as far as being, the first time that we've covered this topic, I really want to thank Andrew, Eileen, Grayson, and Shannon for joining us on the panel today. Your insights and how you're using these tools, I know we only scratched the surface, but I'm sure it was very valuable to those who attended us. And I appreciate that we're a couple minutes after the hour. So with an additional thank you, I'll turn it over to Francesco, our coordinator, to close us out. Francesco, I believe you are muted.
Oh, sorry, my physical microphone was muted. Well, thank you. Yeah, I was just saying thank you very much to all of you. That was a great panel. That was a great discussion that was had. Some very interesting points were brought up. I know I learned a lot listening, and I'm sure that a lot of the audience did as well. I saw a lot of great questions being asked and answered both in the chat and in the Q&A. So thank you so much for also taking the time while answering questions live to also be keeping track of the Q&A. It really also helped with the time. So thank you so much. That was a fantastic session. I'm really happy you were all able to join and make it. Thank you as well, Misha, for helping organize and for moderating as always. And of course, thank you to our audience for being here, taking the time out of your day to join us for these sessions. Yes, thank you. Just as a reminder, the recording will be up on our YouTube channel. It'll also be on the event page. And this is still a monthly series. So we will be having our next session should be in June 5th. So please keep that marked on your calendars if that is of interest. Registration is, as always, open and free. And with that, just one last big thank you to everybody for being here. I think we can end there.